Picture a strip of asphalt that no longer appears on most maps. A road that was once a lifeline, now returned to the earth. This is the story of a forgotten highway near the Mexican border. Not the famous interstates that carry trucks and tourists, not the scenic coastal routes lined with souvenir shops. This is a different kind of road. It runs through a land of extremes, where the sun beats down until the dirt cracks and the wind whispers through dry grass. The highway is still there, in a sense. You can find it if you know where to look, but it takes effort. The pavement has crumbled in places, broken apart by roots and weather. The white lines have faded to ghosts. Guardrails are rusted or gone, and the only vehicles that pass these days are the occasional rancher's pickup or a border patrol SUV moving slow, scanning for signs of trouble. To understand this forgotten highway, you have to go back to a time before the interstate system. Back when the border region was wilder, emptier, and the idea of a paved road was a promise of connection. This is the story of Highway 82, or what some locals still call the Old Border Road. It stretches for about 120 miles, roughly parallel to the Rio Grande, from a small town in Texas called Presidio to the even smaller settlement of Candelaria. But the road doesn't stop there. It continues unofficially as a dirt track that winds through the rugged Chinati Mountains before disappearing into private land. The paved section, the part that was once a state highway, is what I want to talk about. It is a forgotten relic, a monument to ambition, to failure, to the stubbornness of people who tried to make a living in one of the harshest corners of America. The road was built in the early 1930s during the Great Depression. It was part of a larger effort to connect the isolated communities of the Big Bend region to the rest of the state. At that time, Presidio was a bustling little border town, a port of entry for trade with Mexico. The population was a few thousand. There were stores, a hotel, a customs house, a school. People lived off ranching, farming along the river, and smuggling. Yes, smuggling was a big part of the local economy long before drug cartels made the news. Whiskey during Prohibition, then later marijuana, then later still harder drugs. But the highway wasn't built for smugglers. It was built for ranchers to move cattle, for families to travel to the county seat, for mail trucks to deliver letters. It was built for progress. The construction was a brutal undertaking. The terrain is unforgiving. The land is a mix of desert scrub, volcanic rock, and deep arroyos that flood without warning. In summer, temperatures can hit 110 degrees. In winter, cold winds sweep down from the mountains. The workers, mostly local men paid by the Federal Works Progress Administration, used dynamite to blast through hillsides. They laid gravel by hand. They built wooden bridges that have long since rotted away or been replaced by concrete. The road was finished in 1935, and there was a small celebration in Presidio. People drove the entire length, honking their horns, cheering. It was a symbol of hope, but hope does not last forever in the desert. Within a few years, the reality set in. The highway was narrow, only 18 feet wide in most places, with no shoulders. It twisted and turned, following the contours of the land, not the straight line of an engineer's ruler. In the rainy season, the dirt sections turned to mud so deep that even four-wheel drive trucks got stuck. In the dry season, the dust was suffocating, and the isolation never went away. The road did not bring the prosperity people dreamed of. The towns along its path continued to shrink. Ranches failed. The river changed course. The border remained a line on a map, not a source of steady trade. By the 1960s, a new interstate highway, Interstate 10, was built far to the north. It connected El Paso to San Antonio and points east. It was fast and efficient, and it bypassed the entire Big Bend region. The old Highway 82 suddenly became irrelevant. No one needed to drive through Presidio to get to the rest of Texas. You could go around. The state of Texas, which had maintained the road with occasional grading and patching, began to lose interest. By the late 1970s, the highway was officially decommissioned. The state pulled up the sign that said Texas State Highway 8W. They removed it from the official map. The road was no longer maintained. It was left to the elements. Now, more than 4 decades later, the forgotten highway is a strange place. It exists in a kind of limbo. It is still a public right-of-way, meaning anyone can drive on it, but the county does not have the money to maintain it. The federal government, through the National Park Service, has jurisdiction over some adjacent lands, but they do not touch the road. The Border Patrol uses parts of it for patrol routes, but they do not pave it. So the highway has become a scar on the landscape, a human mark that nature is slowly erasing. The asphalt cracks and heaves. Creosote bushes push through the fissures. In some places, the road is completely buried under sand and gravel washed down from the mountains during flash floods. You can only see a faint line in the earth where the pavement used to be. The first time I drove this forgotten highway, I was with a guide named Jesse. He is a local historian, a man in his 70s with a face like a dried apricot and eyes that have seen too much sun. He knows every bend of the road, every ranch gate, every story. We met at a diner in Presidio, a place that serves breakfast all day and has a menu that hasn't changed since 1973. Jesse ordered coffee and told me he would take me out to the old highway, but only if I promised not to drive too fast. There are no guardrails, he said, just a steep drop into an arroyo if you miss the curve. I promised. We left Presidio just after sunrise. The town was still quiet. A few border patrol trucks idled at the gas station. Dogs wandered the empty streets. Jesse drove a battered Ford pickup with a rifle rack in the back window. He said the rifle was for snakes, not people. I believed him. We turned onto Farm to Market Road 170, which is the modern route that parallels the old highway in places. FM 170 is paved and maintained, but it is still a two-lane road that snakes along the Rio Grande. It is beautiful in a stark way. The river is a ribbon of green in a valley of brown. On the other side, the Mexican state of Chihuahua rises in a series of jagged peaks. We drove for about 15 miles, past the tiny community of Ruidosa, where a few houses are scattered among mesquite trees. Then Jesse pulled over at a cattle guard and pointed. "See that," he said. "That is where the old highway begins." I saw nothing but a dirt track leading into the brush. It looked like a ranch road, barely passable. We got out and walked. The ground was hard and cracked. The track was about 20 feet wide. Jesse explained that the original asphalt was still there, buried under a layer of dirt and gravel. Over the years, wind and water had covered it. But if you dug down a few inches, you would find the pavement. He kicked at the ground with his boot, and sure enough, I saw a dark gray chunk of asphalt. It was like uncovering a fossil. We drove a little farther on FM 170 until we reached a point where the old highway was more visible. Here, the asphalt was exposed. It was buckled and broken into pieces like a giant jigsaw puzzle. The edges of the pavement were ragged, and the shoulder was gone. Jesse stopped the truck and we got out again. He walked ahead, pointing out features that I would have missed. "That used to be a bridge," he said, gesturing at a concrete culvert that was half choked with mud. "You could drive over it, but you would not want to. The concrete is crumbling." We peered over the edge. Below, a dry wash. In the rainy season, that wash fills with water in minutes. The water would have covered the road back in the day. That was always a dangerous spot. Jesse told me stories as we walked, stories of people who had driven this road when it was the only way in or out. A woman who went into labor during a storm and had to be carried across a swollen arroyo by her husband. A mail carrier who found a dead body in a ditch, a victim of a shootout between rival smugglers. A family of missionaries whose truck broke down and who had to walk 20 miles to the nearest phone. "The road has a memory," Jesse said. "It holds on to the past. You can feel it if you listen. The landscape here is vast. The sky goes on forever. In the distance, the Chinati Mountains are a blue-gray smear. The air smells like dust and sage. It is silent except for the wind. No birds, no insects, no cars, just the wind moving through the dry grass." Jesse pointed out a small stone building set back from the road. "That was a schoolhouse," he said. "It was built in 1926, before the highway. Kids from nearby ranches would ride horseback to class. The school closed in the 1950s when there were not enough children left. Now it is a ruin. The roof is gone. The walls are covered in graffiti, but you can still see the chalkboard inside," he said. "Someone wrote the letters of the alphabet on it years ago, and they are still visible." We did not go inside. The building looked unstable, and I did not want to step on a rattlesnake. As we continued along the old highway, I began to notice the small details. The faded white line that still clung to the edge of the pavement in a few places. A rusted signpost that once held a speed limit marker, now twisted and lying flat on the ground. The remains of a tire half buried in the dirt. Jesse said that in the 1980s, the road was used by drug smugglers carrying marijuana bales in pickup trucks. They would drive at night with no headlights, using the stars and the feel of the road to navigate. Sometimes they got stuck. Sometimes they crashed. The Border Patrol would find the wrecks days later, the cargo already gone. The road was a convenient route because it was hidden, away from the main highways. But eventually the authorities figured it out. They set up checkpoints. They used aircraft. The smugglers moved to other routes, and the road became truly forgotten. We stopped at a point where the highway passed through a narrow canyon. The walls were volcanic rock, black and sharp. The road was barely wide enough for one vehicle. Jesse said that this was the loneliest part of the journey. In the old days, drivers would honk their horns as they entered the canyon, hoping that no one was coming the other way. If you met another car in here, someone had to back up for miles. Usually the smaller vehicle did the backing. Sometimes they would just sit and wait until the other driver gave up. I could imagine it. The sun beating down, the engine overheating, the frustration, and then the road silent again. The forgotten highway is not just a physical road. It is a metaphor. It represents the dreams that faded, the plans that did not work out, the people who came here hoping for a better life and then left or stayed and endured. The road is a monument to the American frontier, but a frontier that was never fully tamed. It is a reminder that not every story ends in triumph. Some roads lead nowhere. Some roads are abandoned. And yet there is a certain beauty in that abandonment. The road is free. It is wild. It belongs to no one and to everyone. Jesse and I drove for about 2 hours, covering maybe 30 miles of the old highway. The condition varies. Some sections are surprisingly drivable, with smooth pavement that has somehow survived. Other sections are impossible. We had to stop and walk around a washout where the entire road had collapsed into a gully. Jesse said that the road will probably be completely gone within another 20 years. The floods will take more chunks. The vegetation will grow over it. One day, only the memory will remain. But for now, it is still here, a thread connecting the past to the present. As the sun climbed higher, the heat became intense. We turned back. On the drive home, Jesse told me about a ghost town that sits along the old highway. It is called Shafter. It was a silver mining town that boomed in the late 1800s and then busted. By the time the highway was built, Shafter was already a skeleton. A few people still live there, but the post office is long gone. The cemetery is full of miners and their families. The old company store is a crumbling shell. Jesse said that the highway used to run right through the middle of Shafter. You can still see the roadbed. It is a straight line that cuts through the town, but it is overgrown with weeds. I asked him if anyone still drives the old highway through Shafter. He laughed. Not unless they are lost, he said, or looking for something. And that is the thing about forgotten highways. They are for people who are looking for something that was left behind. Something that still whispers in the wind. This road is a place to get lost, not just in the physical sense but in the mental sense. To get lost in time. To stand on a piece of pavement that once carried the hopes of a generation and realize that those hopes have dried up like the river. And yet the road is still there. It is waiting. It is patient. It will outlast us all. I asked Jesse what he thinks about when he drives the forgotten highway. He thought for a moment. He said, "I think about the people who built it, the men with shovels and dynamite. They did not know that the road would be abandoned. They thought they were building a future, and in a way they were. The future just did not turn out the way they imagined, but that does not make their work meaningless. The road is still here. It is a reminder that people tried. They tried to connect, to build, to survive, and that is something worth remembering." We pulled back into Presidio as the heat shimmered off the pavement. The town looked smaller than it had that morning. The shadows were short. The air smelled like tacos and diesel. Jesse dropped me off at the diner. He said he had to go check on some cattle. I thanked him. He nodded. Then he said, "If you come back, I will take you to the part of the highway that goes into the mountains. It is rougher there, more forgotten, but it has the best views of the river." I said I would like that, and I meant it. Now, as I sit here writing this, I think about that forgotten highway. It is a narrow ribbon of broken asphalt that runs through a harsh and beautiful land. It is a line on an outdated map, a scar on the earth, a memory of a time when the border was just a river and the road was the only way across. And it is still there, waiting for someone to drive it, to walk it, to remember it. The forgotten highway near the Mexican border is not just a road. It is a story, and that story is far from over. I remember that feeling of being dropped off at the diner, the heat pressing down, the dust on my boots. I ordered a glass of iced tea and sat by the window, watching the empty street. The waitress was a woman in her 50s named Gloria. She had a faded tattoo of a rose on her forearm and a kindness in her eyes that seemed out of place in that hard land. She asked me what I had been up to, and I told her about the forgotten highway. She nodded as if she had heard that story 1,000 times. She told me that her grandfather had helped build that road. He was a young man then, working for the Works Progress Administration during the Depression. He used to say that the road was the hardest job he ever had. The heat, the rocks, the snakes, but he was proud of it. Every time he drove on it, even after it was abandoned, he would say, "I helped build that." Gloria said he died in 1987, but she still thinks of him whenever she sees a piece of the old highway. She keeps a small chunk of asphalt on her nightstand at home. A souvenir from a road that no one remembers. I asked her if she ever drove it herself. She laughed. "Not in years," she said. "It is too rough, but I used to ride with my father in his pickup. We would go out on Sundays just to see the old places. The schoolhouse, the mining camp, the spot where the river used to cross near the old ford." She said that the road had a rhythm to it. You could feel it in the tires. The bumps and cracks were like a language. She told me about a time when she was a teenager, maybe 16, and she and her cousin drove the road at night. They had a flat tire near the canyon. They had to change it in the dark, using only a matchbook for light. She said they were terrified of rattlesnakes, but they got the tire changed and drove home without incident. Now, when she thinks about it, she laughs. But back then, it was the scariest thing she ever did. I spent the rest of the day in Presidio, wandering around. The town has a quiet dignity. The buildings are old and weathered. The people are friendly but reserved. There is a small museum in an old adobe building that tells the history of the area. I went inside. It was cool and dark. The volunteer at the desk was an elderly man named Tom. He wore a bolo tie and wire-rimmed glasses. He asked if I was interested in the highway. I said yes. He led me to a corner of the museum where there was a display about the old road. There were black and white photographs of construction crews, men in hats standing next to steam shovels, a photograph of a bridge being built over the Pillars Arroyo. The bridge is still there, Tom said, but it is closed now. The wood is rotting. The highway department did not want to maintain it, so they just blocked it off. He pointed to a map on the wall. It showed the old highway as a red line, winding south and west from Marfa to Presidio. You could see how it followed the terrain, hugging the arroyos, skirting the mountains. It was a route of necessity, not of efficiency. Tom told me that the highway was part of a larger system, a network of roads that connected the remote ranching communities to the outside world. Before it was built, people traveled by wagon or horseback. It could take 3 days to get from Presidio to Marfa. The highway cut that time to a few hours. It changed everything. And then when the new road was built to the west, it changed everything again. The old highway became a relic, but for a few decades it was the heartbeat of the region. I asked Tom if he had ever driven it. He smiled. I was born in 1946, he said. I grew up on a ranch near the old highway. We used to drive it to school. I remember the dust and the potholes. My father would curse every time we hit one, but it was our road. When they built the new highway, it was like losing a part of ourselves. We still drove the old road sometimes, just for old time's sake, but it became harder and harder to pass. The last time I drove it was about 10 years ago. I had to stop because a washout had taken a chunk out of the road. I got out and walked. I stood in the middle of the pavement and looked around. There was no sound, just the wind. I felt like I was standing in a memory. He paused. You know, I think that road is more alive now than when it was busy, because now it is just what it is. It does not have to pretend to be anything else. His words stayed with me. I drove back to the highway the next morning, this time on my own. I had borrowed a truck from a man I met at the diner, a rancher named Esteban. He offered it to me when he heard I wanted to explore the old road. He said, "Take it. It is not much, but it will get you where you are going. Just watch out for the washouts." I promised I would be careful. I headed out as the sun was rising, the shadows long and cool. The pavement on the new highway was smooth, and I quickly turned onto the old road at the same junction Jesse had shown me. This time I drove slowly, taking in the details. The road was more broken than I remembered from the day before. Perhaps I was just noticing it more. There were cracks wide enough to swallow a tire. The pavement had heaved and buckled in places, forming small waves. I could see where water had flowed across the road, leaving a layer of silt and gravel. I stopped near the schoolhouse and got out. The building looked even more decayed in the morning light. The graffiti on the walls was bright and fresh. Someone had spray-painted a skull and crossbones near the door. I walked up to the open doorway and peered inside. The chalkboard was still there, just as Jesse had said. The letters of BCD were faint but legible. I could see where someone had erased something and written new letters over it. The floor was covered in rubble and broken glass. A lizard darted across the wall. I stepped back and took a photograph. The image is still on my phone. I look at it sometimes, and I think about the children who sat in that room, learning their ABCs in a building that was once the center of a community. Now it is a ruin. The road that brought them there is a ruin too, but the letters remain. I continued driving, deeper into the forgotten highway. The landscape changed. The flat desert gave way to rolling hills and then to the foothills of the Chinati Mountains. The road became rougher, more eroded. I passed the entrance to a canyon that I had not noticed before. A dirt track branched off the main road, heading into the rocks. I decided to follow it. The track was narrow, barely wide enough for the truck. Branches scraped the sides. The truck groaned as it climbed. After maybe a mile, the track ended at a sheer rock face. There was a small cave at the base. I got out and walked to the cave. It was shallow, maybe 20 feet deep. The floor was covered in sand. There were cigarette butts and empty cans. Someone had been here recently. I found a small pile of ashes and the remains of a fire. On the wall of the cave, there was a carving. It was a date, 1886, and a name, J. Rodriguez. I wondered who he was, a cowboy, a miner, a bandit. He had carved his name into the rock, and it was still there over 100 years later. The Forgotten Highway is full of these small monuments. They are not on any map. They are not in any museum. They are just there, waiting for someone to find them. I drove back to the main road and continued south. The road began to descend toward the Rio Grande. I could see the green ribbon of the river in the distance, a strip of life in the brown desert. The road curved and twisted. I passed the ruins of an old ranch house. The roof was gone. The walls were made of adobe, melting back into the earth. A windmill stood nearby, its blade still. There was a rusty pump and a trough filled with mud. I could imagine the family that had lived here, raising cattle, growing corn, watching the river flood in the spring. They had their own road, a dirt track that connected to the highway. Now the track was overgrown, barely visible. The highway itself was a ghost, but the land remembers, the river remembers, the wind remembers. I stopped at the spot where the highway used to cross the Pillars Arroyo. The bridge was still there, as Tom had said, but it was blocked by a metal gate and a sign that read "Bridge closed." I parked and walked up to the gate. The bridge was a wooden structure, old and weathered. The planks were rotting, some were missing. I could see the arroyo below, a dry wash of sand and rocks. Bridge had been built in the 193's rows, and it had held up remarkably well, but now it was unsafe. I stood on the gate and looked across. On the other side, the road continued, equally broken. I thought about the cars that had crossed this bridge. The families, the workers, the smugglers. They had all passed this way, and now no one did. I drove back to Presidio as the afternoon heat built. I returned the truck to Esteban and thanked him. He asked how the road was. I told him it was beautiful. He nodded. He said, "It is a good road. It has a lot of stories." I asked him if he had any stories of his own. He thought for a moment. Then he said, "When I was a boy, my father used to take me to the old highway to look for spare parts. People would throw things out of their trucks, tires, tools, even money. Once we found a suitcase full of clothes. Someone must have lost it. We took it home. My mother washed the clothes and gave them to my sisters. The suitcase is still in my shed." He laughed. That road gave us things. It was like a second-hand store. I asked him if he ever found anything valuable. Said the most valuable thing I ever found was a photograph. It was a picture of a woman standing by a car. She was smiling. The car was parked on the old highway. The background was the mountains. I still have that photograph. It is in my house. I look at it sometimes and wonder who she was. She had a beautiful smile. I think she was happy. And that is valuable, to have a moment of happiness frozen in time. I left Presidio the next day. I drove west on the new highway toward the mountains. As I drove, I kept looking to my left, where the old highway ran parallel, a ghost road in the desert. I could see it in places, a dark line against the pale earth. I knew that I would never drive it again. But I also knew that it would stay with me. The road was not just a road. It was a story about change, about loss, about the people who built a future that did not last. And yet that future still exists in fragments. The letters on a chalkboard, the name carved in a cave, the photograph of a smiling woman. The Forgotten Highway is a reminder that everything passes, but nothing is truly forgotten. The road endures even as it crumbles, and those of us who walk on it carry a piece of it with us. Now when I think about that highway, I think about the wind. I think about the sound of the gravel under my boots. I think about Jesse and Gloria and Tom and Esteban. I think about the one that came before them, the ones who carved their names and built their dreams. The Forgotten Highway is a place where time dissolves. It is a place where you can stand and feel the weight of history. It is a place that asks nothing of you except that you listen. And if you listen, you will hear the stories. They are all there, waiting in the dust. They are not loud. They are not dramatic. They are just whispers, but they are enough. I pulled over at a viewpoint near the summit of the pass. I could see the river below and the Mexican town across the border. The old highway was visible as a faint scar on the hillside. I took out my notebook and wrote down what I had seen. I wanted to remember everything. I wanted to capture the feeling of that road, the loneliness and the beauty, the decay and the persistence. And I realized that I was not just writing about a road. I was writing about the human need to connect, to build, to leave a mark. The highway was a mark. It was a line drawn across the desert, and even though it is no longer used, it still holds meaning. It still tells a story. I closed my notebook and started the truck. I drove on, leaving the old highway behind, but I know I will return. Someday I will drive it again, or maybe I will walk it, because the road is still there. It is waiting, and as long as it waits, the story continues. I closed my notebook and started the truck. I drove on, leaving the old highway behind. But I know I will return. Someday I will drive it again, or maybe I will walk it, because the road is still there. It is waiting, and as long as it waits, the story continues. But the return did not wait long. A few months later, I found myself back in the borderlands, drawn by an inexplicable pull. I had been thinking about the road constantly. It had become a kind of obsession. I would wake up in the middle of the night, the image of that abandoned bridge or the ABC chalkboard floating in my mind. I had to go back. This time, I planned to spend a week on the forgotten highway. I wanted to walk its entire length, from the ghost town of Shafter all the way to the end near the river. I wanted to see it in different light, at dawn and dusk under the full moon. I wanted to hear the silence. I arrived in Marfa on a Thursday evening. The town was quiet. The art galleries were closing for the night. I checked into a small motel on the main street. The room was clean and simple. A painting of a cowboy on a horse hung above the bed. I slept badly, my mind racing with anticipation. The next morning, I packed a backpack with water, food, a notebook, and a camera. I drove south on Highway 67, past the old Fort D.A. Russell, past the rows of empty barracks. The morning was cool, the sky a pale blue. I turned onto the gravel road that led to the old highway. I parked at the same spot where I had left Tom's truck months ago. The air was still. A raven sat on a fence post, watching me. I stepped onto the highway. It felt different today. The gravel was softer, the cracks wider. I started walking. The sun climbed slowly, casting long shadows behind me. I walked for an hour without seeing a single car. The only sounds were my boots on the gravel and the occasional cry of a hawk. I passed the remains of a windmill, its blades frozen in a half-turn. The metal was rusted, the wooden tower leaning. I stopped and touched the iron. It was cold. I wondered how many years it had stood there, pumping water for a ranch that no longer existed. I thought about the man who built it, digging a well by hand, hauling the heavy iron pieces across the desert. He had a dream of a self-sufficient life. That dream was gone, but the windmill remained. I walked on. The road curved around a hill, and suddenly I saw it, a cluster of buildings in the distance. A ghost town. I had not noticed it on my first trip. It was not marked on any map. The buildings were weathered adobe and wood, their roofs collapsed. I approached slowly. The first building was a small church. A bell tower still stood, but the bell was gone. The wooden cross on the roof was leaning. I stepped inside. The floor was dirt. The altar was a simple table. Someone had placed a jar of wildflowers there recently. Not long ago, someone had come here to pray. I lit a candle from my backpack and placed it on the altar. I said a silent prayer for the people who had once filled this church, for their joys and sorrows. Then I moved on. Next to the church was a general store. The sign was still there, painted on the wood, mercantile. The windows were boarded up. I found a gap in the boards and peered inside. Shelves lined the walls, empty. A counter stood in the middle, covered in dust. A pair of glasses lay on the floor, cracked. I imagined a shopkeeper, an old man with a kind face, weighing flour and sugar for the local families. He knew everyone by name. He knew their stories. Now his glasses were a relic. I walked around the back of the store. There was a corral and a small barn. The barn door was open. Inside, I found an old wagon, its wheels missing. The wood was splintered. The metal frame was rusted. It was a ghost wagon from a ghost town. I continued through the town. There were maybe a dozen buildings, some reduced to piles of rubble. I found a house with a collapsed roof. Inside, I could see the remains of a stove, a bed frame, a child's shoe. The shoe was small, leather, worn through at the toe. I picked it up. It felt light in my hand. I imagined a child running through the dusty streets, laughing. That child grew up, left, or died. The shoe remained. I placed it back gently, as if it were a sacred object. I realized that this town was a cemetery of everyday life. The objects were tombstones. I sat on the steps of the mercantile and drank water. The sun was high now. Heat shimmered off the ground. I took out my notebook and wrote, "The ghost town is not a place of sadness. It is a place of memory. The people who lived here are not gone. They are in the dust, in the wind, in the shoe of a child. I am a visitor in their world. I am a witness." I walked on. The road continued through a low pass. On the other side, the terrain opened up into a broad valley. I could see the river again, a thin green line in the distance. I walked for another 2 hours. My legs ached. My throat was dry. I stopped at a shady spot under a cottonwood tree. The tree was old, its trunk thick. There was a spring nearby, a seep of water that formed a small pool. I knelt and drank. The water was cool and sweet. I splashed my face. I sat back and listened. The only sound was the rustle of leaves. I felt a profound peace. I was alone on the forgotten highway, but I was not lonely. I felt connected to everything around me, the earth, the sky, the river, the tree. The road was not a barrier. It was a thread. I walked until late afternoon. The sun began to sink toward the mountains. The light turned golden, then amber. The shadows stretched. I reached the place where the highway met the Pillars Arroyo once more. The bridge was still closed. I decided to walk across it anyway. The gate was locked, but I climbed over. The wood groaned under my weight. I stepped carefully, avoiding the missing planks. I could see the arroyo below, a dry wash of sand and rocks. I crossed slowly, my heart pounding. When I reached the other side, I felt a surge of triumph. I had crossed the bridge that no one else was allowed to cross. I looked back at the sign, "Bridge closed." I laughed. The road was telling me that it was still open in a way. I continued on the other side. The road was in worse condition here. Erosion had carved deep gullies. I had to walk around them. The remains of telephone poles lay by the side of the road, their wires tangled. I found a rusted license plate, Texas 1956. I picked it up. The numbers were still legible, B7 on it, W3. I wondered whose car it had been. A farmer, a teacher, a traveling salesman. The plate had been lost for over 60 years. I thought about the journey it had made, bouncing off a trunk, landing in the dust. Now it was a piece of history. I put it in my backpack. It felt right to take it, not as a souvenir but as a symbol. The sun was setting. I found a spot to camp, a flat area near a cluster of mesquite trees. I set up my small tent. I gathered dead wood and built a fire. The flames crackled. The sky turned orange, then purple, then black. The stars came out, thousands of them. I lay on my back and watched them. The Milky Way was a bright band across the sky. I felt small and vast at the same time. I thought about the people who had walked this same road, people who had looked up at these same stars. The stars had not changed, the road had, but the stars were a constant. They had witnessed everything, the building of the highway, the boom years, the decline, the abandonment. They did not judge, they just watched. I slept fitfully. The wind picked up in the night, blowing sand against the tent. I dreamed of the road. I dreamed I was walking and the road stretched forever. In the dream, I met a man. He was old with a weathered face and kind eyes. He said, "I built this road." I asked him why. He said, "Because people needed to get to the river. People needed to get to their families. People needed to get to their dreams." I woke up with the name Jesse on my lips. I remembered the man from the diner. The road had been built by people like him, people with dirt on their hands and hope in their hearts. Dawn came slowly. The sky lightened from black to gray to pink. I crawled out of the tent. The air was cold. I built another fire and boiled water for coffee. I sat and watched the sun rise over the mountains. The road was a dark line on the landscape. I knew I had a long walk back to the truck, but I was not in a hurry. I took my time. I packed my tent and walked east back toward the bridge. I crossed it again in the morning light. This time the wood felt more solid. I had gotten used to it. I thought about how we adapt to decay. We learn to trust what is broken if it still holds. I reached the truck by midday. I was tired, sunburned, and happy. I drove back to Marfa. I stopped at the same diner. Jessie was not there, but the waitress Gloria was. She remembered me. She asked if I had been on the road again. I said yes. She smiled. She said, "That road gets into your blood." I nodded. She brought me a plate of enchiladas and a glass of iced tea. I ate slowly, savoring the flavors. I thought about how food tastes better after walking. I thought about how everything tastes better when you have been in the desert. I spent the next 2 days in Marfa, talking to people, reading about the history of the highway. I visited the local museum. There was a small exhibit on the old road. A photograph showed a bus stopped at a general store in 1948. The bus was full of families. They were smiling. The caption said they were going to a picnic by the river. I looked at the faces. They were hopeful. They were happy. I realized that the road was not just a route. It was a place of joy. It was a place of connection. The highway had brought people together. It had given them experiences. It had been a stage for their lives. I drove back to Presidio one last time. I wanted to see Esteban again. I found him at his repair shop. He was working on an old pickup truck. He looked up and smiled. He said, "You came back." I said, "I had to." I told him about my walk. He listened intently. When I finished, he said, "You are now part of the road." He looked at me with an expression I could not read. Then he said, "Would you like to see the photograph I told you about, the one I found?" I said yes. He wiped his hands and led me to his house, a small adobe home behind the shop. Inside, it was cool and dark. He pointed to a framed photograph on the wall. It was the woman smiling by the car. She was young, maybe 25. She wore a white dress and a wide-brimmed hat. The car was a 1950 sedan, maybe a Chevrolet. The background was the mountains. She was radiant. There was a joy in her eyes that was timeless. I stared at the photograph for a long time. I asked Esteban if he knew who she was. He shook his head. He said, "But I imagine her driving down the road with her family. She was going to a picnic. She was happy, and that is enough." I left Presidio with the photograph in my mind. I drove home, but the road did not leave me. It stayed. It became a part of my thoughts. I started researching other forgotten highways along the border. There were many. Each one had its own story. Some were shorter, some were longer, some were paved, some were dirt. But they all shared a common thread. They were built for a purpose that had faded. They were remnants of a time when the border was a place of movement, not division. The forgotten highway I had walked was just one example of a network of roads that connected communities on both sides. Families crossed daily for work, for school, for shopping. The road was a lifeline. Now, with increased security and checkpoints, those crossings are fewer. The roads fall into disrepair. The bridges are closed. The chalkboards gather dust. I think about the people who still live along those forgotten highways. They are like Esteban, holding on to memories, finding value in what is left behind. They are like Jesse, who remembers when the road was new and the future was bright. They are like Gloria, who sees the road every day and knows its moods. The highway is not forgotten to them. It is a part of their landscape, their history. They live with the ruins. They accept them. They adapt. I returned to the highway one more time a year later. This time, I brought a tent and planned to stay a week. I walked the entire length from Shafter to the river. I kept a journal. I wrote about the wind, the dust, the animals, the plants. I wrote about the way the light changes the colors of the mountains. I wrote about the silence that is never truly silent because there is always a sound, a cricket, a bird, a distant truck. I wrote about the people I met along the way. I met a man herding goats. He was old and brown as the earth. He told me he had lived in the same house for 70 years. He pointed to the highway and said, "I remember when they built it. We used to watch the trucks go by. Now the trucks are gone, but the goats stay." He laughed. He had no teeth. His laughter was a high, dry sound. I gave him a pack of cookies. He thanked me. He said, "You are a good man to walk this road. Most people forget it, but the road does not forget them." I walked on. The last day, I reached the Rio Grande. The river was low, a trickle in the wide bed. I crossed on foot, wading through the shallow water, my boots filled with mud. The water was cold. On the other side, I stood on Mexican soil. There was no fence, no patrol, just desert. I turned and looked back at the highway. It ended abruptly at the riverbank. The road did not continue on the other side. It was a dead end, but the river was a connection. The road had reached its destination. It had served its purpose. For many years, people had crossed here. They had traded, they had loved, they had built lives on both sides. The road was a bridge between two countries. Now it was a monument to that unity. I sat on a rock and watched the sun set over Mexico. The sky was streaked with orange and pink. The mountains were silhouettes. I thought about the children who learned their ABCs in that schoolhouse. I thought about the woman in the photograph. I thought about the old man herding goats. I thought about Esteban and his suitcase full of clothes. I thought about Tom and his vintage car. I thought about all the people who had told me their stories. The forgotten highway had given me a gift. It had shown me that even in decay there is beauty. Even in loss there is meaning. The road was not dead. It was alive in the memories of those who had walked it. I made a decision. I would write a book about the forgotten highway. I would collect the stories. I would preserve them. I would make sure that the road was not completely forgotten. I had already started. The notebook in my backpack was full. I had recorded names, dates, photographs. I had captured the voices. I would turn them into words that could be shared. The highway had given me its stories. It was my turn to give them back. I returned to the river again the next morning. I crossed back to the American side. I walked to my truck, which I had left at the end of the road. I drove away slowly. In my rearview mirror, the highway shrank. Soon it was just a line of dust, but I knew it was still there. It would always be there. The forgotten highway is not a place of endings. It is a place of beginnings. It begins with a story, and the story never ends. It only waits for the next traveler, the next listener, the next witness. I am one of them, and I am grateful. I drove home with the image of the woman in the white dress and the wide-brimmed hat fixed in my mind. She was real. She had existed. She had stood by her car on a summer day 70 years ago, smiling at the camera, her whole life ahead of her. I wanted to know her name, her story, but I respected Esteban's belief that some mysteries are better left untouched. The photograph was a symbol, not a document. It stood for every traveler who had ever passed that way, every family that had piled into a sedan and driven down the highway to picnic on the riverbank. It was a reminder that the road had once been alive with laughter and hope, and that was enough. I began to write the book that summer. I rented a small cabin outside Terlingua, a town that itself felt like a forgotten highway. It was a place of stone walls and rusted roofs, where the only sound was the wind and the occasional cry of a roadrunner. I set up a desk by a window that faced the Chizos Mountains. I spread my notebooks across the table. I arranged the photographs I had taken: the general store, the schoolhouse, the bridge, the riverbank, the rusted car, the mailbox, Esteban's repair shop, the diner, the faces of the people I had met. I pinned them to corkboard and stared at them for hours. I wrote down everything I remembered. The descriptions came easily. The emotions came with effort, but the stories came from the people. I called Gloria at the diner. She gave me the number of a woman who had grown up in Shafter. I drove 2 hours to meet her. Her name was Alina. She was 75 years old, a retired teacher with silver hair and a sharp mind. She invited me into her small house in Alpine. The walls were lined with books and photographs. She served me coffee and pan dulce. She told me about her childhood along the highway. She had walked to school every morning. She remembered the buses that passed, the trucks that rumbled, the occasional tourist who stopped to ask for directions. She remembered the river before the drought. She said, "We used to swim in it. The water was clear and cold. We would spend all day there." She pulled out a photo album. There was a picture of her and her sister standing on the bridge, their feet dangling over the water. It was black and white. They were laughing. I looked at the bridge in the photo. It was the same bridge I had walked across, but here it was full of life, not rust and silence. I felt a pang of loss. I wrote down every word she said. I drove to Presidio again. I found Jesse at his ranch. He was older now, a little slower. He still had that same quiet wisdom in his eyes. I told him I was writing a book. He nodded. He said, "Don't forget the good times. The road had good times. Don't just write about the broken parts." I promised him I would not. He took me to the back of his property where a pile of old lumber and bed springs lay in the grass. He said, "That was my father's truck. We drove it to town every Saturday. I sat in the back with my brothers. The road was dirt then. We got covered in dust. My mother would shake her head and make us wash with the hose before we came inside." He smiled. The memory was still vivid. I took a photograph of the rusted springs. He said, "That old truck brought us to the highway. Without it, we would have been stuck out here." The highway gave us connection. I spent a week in the library in Marfa, combing through old newspapers. I found an article from 1948 about the opening of a new stretch of the highway. It was celebrated with a parade. There were photographs of children waving flags, of a pickup truck decorated with crepe paper, of the mayor cutting a ribbon. The road was a symbol of progress. It was a promise of a better future. I read another article from 1965 about a plan to pave the road. It had been delayed. Then another from 1975 about the decline in traffic. The articles grew shorter and less optimistic. By the 1990s, the road was mentioned only in passing as a reminder of what used to be. I clipped each article and added it to my growing archive. I returned to the highway itself. I walked it again, but this time I walked it with purpose. I stopped at every landmark. I measured the distances. I counted the miles between the schoolhouse and the river. I measured the width of the bridge. I took notes on the condition of the asphalt. I recorded the sounds, the wind, the birds, the occasional distant engine. I sat at the riverbank for an entire day. I watched the water flow. It was slow, almost stagnant, but it was flowing. I realized that the river was the true constant. The road was a visitor. The river had been there before the road, and it would be there after. The road was a human invention, a line drawn across the land to serve a need. The river was a natural boundary, a lifeline, a participant in the cycles of time. The road ended at the river, but the river continued. I met a man named Carlos on the Mexican side. He was fishing with a simple pole. He was young, maybe 30. He wore a straw hat and a faded shirt. I crossed the river to talk to him. He spoke English well. He told me he had grown up in a small village several miles inland. He came to the river every weekend to fish. He said, "My grandfather used to cross this river every day. He worked on a ranch in Texas. He walked across the bridge. The bridge was open then. He would come home at night with money for food." He pointed to the rusted girders of the bridge. "Now the bridge is closed. I cannot cross. I have to fish here and hope." He said it without bitterness. He said it as a fact. I asked him what he thought of the highway on the other side. He shrugged. He said, "I do not think about it. It is just a road that ends." But then he added, "But I think about the people who used to come across. They were always friendly. They gave us things. My grandmother had a friend in Presidio. They wrote letters for years. The letters stopped when the road closed." He looked at the bridge again. "The road was a connection. Now it is a wall." I wrote that down. I wrote it in my notebook, and later I typed it into my manuscript. It became a central theme. The highway was not just a road. It was a symbol of connection. Its decay was a symbol of division. I thought about the families that had been separated, the communities that had withered, the shared history that was slowly being forgotten. The road was a casualty of policy and politics, of changing economies and shifting priorities. But the people who lived along it were not casualties. They adapted. They survived, they remembered. I spent the next months writing. I wrote about the schoolhouse with the chalkboard. I wrote about the general store with the faded sign. I wrote about the bridge, the mailbox, the rusted car, the photograph, the suitcase. I wrote about the walk, the heat, the thirst, the dust. I wrote about the people: Esteban, Jesse, Gloria, Elena, Carlos, the old man herding goats, the woman in the white dress. I wrote about the river and the mountains and the sky. I wrote about the silence and the sound. I wrote about the past and the present and the possibility of the future. When the manuscript was finished, I sat on the porch of my cabin and read it from beginning to end. It was a little over 200 pages. It was not a history book. It was not a travelogue. It was a collection of moments, a mosaic of memories, a song for a road that had been forgot. I felt a quiet satisfaction. The road had given me its stories. I had given them back. I closed the file and saved it. I looked out at the mountains. The sun was setting. The sky was turning the colors of the desert: orange, pink, purple, gold. The air was cool and dry. I thought about the woman in the photograph. I wondered if she would be proud that her image had inspired a book. I hoped so. I drove to Presidio one last time. I went to Esteban's repair shop. I gave him a copy of my manuscript. He could not read English, but I had a friend translate a few pages into Spanish. I read him the part about the photograph. He listened, his eyes closed. When I finished, he opened his eyes and looked at me. He said, "You have honored her. You have honored the road." He shook my hand. His grip was strong. He said, "Come back. I will show you more stories. This road has many." I said I would. I drove away from Presidio for the last time. In my rearview mirror, the highway grew small. The mountains rose behind it. The river was a silver thread in the distance. The road was still there. It would always be there. The forgotten highway near the Mexican border is not a place of endings. It is a place of beginnings. It begins with a story, and the story never ends. It only waits for the next traveler, the next listener, the next witness. I am one of them, and I am grateful. I am grateful for the road, for the dust, for the rust, for the memory, for the people who shared their lives with me. The highway is forgotten by most, but it is remembered by those who matter. And now perhaps it will be remembered by a few more. The words will carry it into the future. The stories will keep it alive. As long as there is a reader, there is a road. And as long as there is a road, there is a journey worth taking.